Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Greg Robinson, a native New Yorker, is Professor of History at l'Université du Québec à Montréal, a French language institution in Montreal, Canada. We will be discussing the article Postwar Japanese Emigration to the Dominican Republic. So let's have a listen.
I wanted to thank you so much, Professor Robinson, for coming on to the podcast to talk about the post-war Japanese immigration to the Dominican Republic. Again, these are just stories that aren't really, or narratives that aren't really told or discussed. So I do appreciate you coming on and speaking about this. And before we start, can I just have you do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes. My name is Greg Robinson. I'm professor at history of l'Université du Québec à Montréal, the University of Quebec at Montreal for the French challenged. I teach American history.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So we'll start. And I just wanted to ask you, I guess, the first question being, what motivated you to write this aspect of post-war migration of the Japanese to Dominican Republic?
Well, part of it is that I got involved with a buddy, Seth Jacobowitz, who was working with the Center for Dominican Studies at CUNY, and I was always interested in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti. I wrote a book about the American evangelist and abolitionist James Theodore Holly and his life in Haiti, and I have relatives through marriage who are in the Dominican Republic, and a lot of friends who are from the Dominican Republic. And so it seemed a natural thing, and also, again, to just extend our understanding of Japanese emigration into the New World and the Asian presence in the Dominican Republic and in the Caribbean generally.
No, thank you so much for that. It's always when you have a personal connection, it makes it that much more stronger to write on to something. So would you be able to define what the Nikkei and what it means?
Yes, Nikkei means people of Japanese ancestry, especially the Japanese diaspora outside of Japan. So we can speak of both the immigrant generation, the Issei, in the case of the Japanese, and then their children, the second generation born in the other countries, who are called the Nisei.
Okay, perfect. And then what were the primary factors that led the Japanese to emigrate to Dominican Republic after World War II?
So after World War II, you have a situation where Japan is rebuilding economically. There's widespread poverty. And so the Japanese government is interested in restarting emigration. During the turn of the 20th century, Japan had been actively involved in settling people of Japanese ancestry outside of Japan in places first like the United States and Canada, also in Australia and New Caledonia, also in the Japanese Empire as it developed, Manchuria, Taiwan, etc. And finally, after the gates were closed by the United States and Canada in 1907, 1908 with the so-called Gentleman's Agreement, with emigration of Japanese planned and unplanned to places like Brazil and Peru and Mexico.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. And of course, how did the Japanese government and the Dominican Republic facilitate this migration?
So the Japanese government had a long-standing relationship with Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, which lasted since the 1930s. In fact, in the 1930s, the Dominican Republic had been one of the very few countries in the world to recognize the Japanese puppet state of Manchuria, that was so-called Manchukuo. So he had long-standing ties to Japan, whether based on his interest in Japanese military strength, in the possibility of Japanese technology transfer to the Dominican Republic, or just mutual enmity toward the United States. So in the 1950s, even as Japanese bureaucrats tried to figure out where to resettle excess Japanese outside of Japan and outside of Asia, because, of course, because of the Japanese actions in World War II, they were not welcome mostly in Asia. So he looked again to South America. They looked again to South America as during the pre-war period. Trujillo was interested in bringing in some thousands of Japanese families. He didn't want single immigrants, as in the old days. He wanted families. And if you ask why he wanted Japanese, it's not completely clear, but there is a mix of reasons. One is that he wanted to develop the farming economy of the Dominican Republic, and he thought the Japanese would make good farmers. Another thing is that he wanted fishermen to improve, again, the nutrition and health of the Dominican people, and he thought the Japanese would make good fishermen. Also, he wanted Japanese strategically. In 1957, there's the Haitian Revolution, and Papa Doc, François Duvalier, takes over and establishes a dictatorship, and there's political tension between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Trujillo fears that Papa Doc might want to make an invasion of the Dominican Republic, so he wants to reinforce the population on the border to serve as a bulwark, as a wall against Haiti. And that's a very unpopulated part of the country. And so he has an interest in accepting these immigrants, and he enters into discussion with the Japanese government, and it goes so well that he's actually awarded a decoration from the Japanese government. I think it's the Order of the Rising Sun or the Order of the Silver Star. I forget which particular order it is. But in any case, he thought that he would be able to have Japan pay for the sending of the immigrants. In fact, the Japanese will charter ships and make the immigrants pay for their own transport, and it will give them some tools, and he will provide the land and pay a small salary.
Wow, that's well, and I guess this probably leads into, I guess, the conditions in which Japan that pushed people to emigrate during this period. And I know you mentioned where they all kind of ended up in the Dominican Republic and elsewhere.
That's right. Again, some Japanese immigrants went to Brazil, but Brazil started to slow down the numbers of Japanese that it accepted. A few Japanese came to the United States, but it was very carefully supervised, that immigration. So there was an excess of immigrants ready, but they didn't really want to go to the Dominican Republic, and the Japanese government was unable to fulfill their quota. I now remember that the order that Trujillo got was the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. So anyway, yes, so only a small number of people, they planned for about 800 every year for 5 years, but in the 4 years that they were put on the program, only about 1,500 Japanese total agreed to move. So again, the Dominican Republic was a backward place. The plans were not clear. The facilities they would have were not clear. The Japanese immigrants hardly or didn't at all speak Spanish. So it was not a propitious thing for them, even in the context of a post-war Japanese economy where they were suffering from poverty and underdevelopment.
Yeah, I can see that. And what were some of the initial challenges faced by the Japanese immigrants upon the arrival to Dominican Republic?
Okay, well, one of it is that, again, since they didn't speak Spanish, and because they were so racially different, they faced a great amount of prejudice from the Dominicans themselves, who thought that they were benefiting from special conditions and unjustly being promoted over the native people of the Dominican Republic. Another thing was that they had trouble getting access to enough land to support themselves, and there were not adequate water irrigation supplies in the farmland that they were given in the mountainous regions near the Haitian border. And the fishermen were not given adequate boats and supplies, and they had to try and figure out about fishing in a place that was very different from Japan, where the fish were different, where the conditions were different. I mean, you can imagine you've been fishing your whole life in one place, and then you're sent to another place where the conditions are completely different, and you have to learn from scratch how to be a fisherman.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I guess, what kind of communities then did the Japanese immigrants establish, and how did they maintain their cultural identity?
Well, I'm not completely clear. I know that they were small rural communities, so they lived in villages more or less by themselves, by the force of the thing. Again, they didn't speak Spanish. They were given very rudimentary conditions. They didn't have ready-made housing, so they made do with what they had, and they started farming things like coffee and peanuts and crops that they weren't necessarily, again, used to producing and preparing. It certainly wasn't a big rice economy, although, of course, rice is part of the diet of the Dominican Republic. It's not at all the kind of rice that one produces in Japan. So I think that they faced a great amount of perplexity and discontent almost as soon as they got there. Things that were not at all the kind of paradise that they had been led to expect. They probably expected a great deal more in the way of help, either from the Japanese government or from the Dominican Republic. But again, this is not an unusual thing in the case of sponsored immigration. There are always stories of people who came expecting wonderful conditions and had to make do with the best they could.
No, for sure, definitely. And I guess how would you say that, the Japanese presence as immigrants in Dominican Republic, did it have an effect, since you mentioned that they isolated themselves?
I think that they were very isolated. There wasn't a great deal of news about them. I think the local people looked at them with some curiosity, some hostility, a certain amount of interest, and they would just fish out of water, as they say. There weren't that many of them. They weren't prepared to enter into this new kind of adventure. They didn't speak Spanish. They're religious. There was a religious difference. There were very few Catholics among these Japanese, and so I can imagine that they just stood out. That they really were not able to make a place for themselves in their new country.
Okay. And would you say, were there any personal stories or testimonies from the Japanese immigrants that stood out during your research of this article?
Now, a lot of the research that I did was based on translations of things that were in Japanese, to a lesser extent in Spanish, and there were some already existing testimonies. I thought that, again, a lot of what I read was the bitterness of people that felt they had been abandoned.
Definitely, I can imagine, because if you don't speak the language and there's not a lot of support, whether from your native country or from the new one that you're going to, it can be rather, I guess, psychologically kind of demanding as well, right? So
yeah, it's very alienating, I think.
yes,
people thought they'd been tricked.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And then, what were some of, I guess you probably mentioned some of these, but what were some of the controversies or conflicts that arose between these Japanese immigrants and the local population?
Well, I think there was competition for scarce resources. There was competition for water. There was competition for fertilizer. There was competition for food, particularly after Trujillo himself dies, and his regime is more and more occupied with other things and is not in a position to give aid to the migrants, and it would be unpopular to give aid to the migrants. So it's sort of a catch-as-catch-can situation. And I think it's just sort of a perfect storm of bad planning and under developed resources, and just an impossible connection between very different people.
Yeah, for sure. And then, how can we ensure that this history of the Japanese immigration to the Dominican Republic is preserved and respected?
Well, there are these books by authors both in Japanese and in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even a monument in Japan. There are authors, scholars such as Valentina Peguero, Toke Endo, Alberto Despradel, and Chutaro Kobayashi. There is no full-length English language work, but I think that there are the roots of a thing. See, my own particular contribution was to write about the aid for the migrants from Japanese Americans on the West Coast once they started going back to Japan. I didn't do a lot of original research in their lives in the Dominican Republic. I was also researching during the time of COVID when I wasn't able to get around. But also, again, that story has been told. As you perfectly well say, there's the problem with keeping it alive and making people aware of it. And so, needless to say, I'm very grateful and delighted that you invited me to this podcast, because I think it's a very important story indeed. And so it's good that we find different ways to tell it and to make people interested.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more on that, because again, it's just one of these narratives that are just not really discussed. And, as we close, would you say that, what would be your final thoughts for anyone kind of looking into this topic?
I think it was, again, a perfect storm of bad planning, incompatible people, insufficient resources, and a sort of hubris among the part of Japanese bureaucrats that they could restart a program of sponsored emigration, really rather on the model of the old imperial Japan, and place Japanese to make a kind of little Japan elsewhere. And so it ended up with a horrid conclusion that 2/3 of the Japanese colonists left, and they were really shipwrecked in a sense. They were forced to go back on ships. Luckily, they got some aid from Japanese Americans who raised money for these people. But when they arrived in Japan, they sort of barricaded themselves on the ships, trying to plead for aid from the Japanese government and reparations for what they had received. I think it's a warning sign for us that it's not so easy to make a plan for mass emigration. Of course, I'm influenced by my work on James Theodore Hawley. He put together a phalanx of a colonization movement of 2,000 Black Americans who landed in Haiti in 1861, right at the moment of the American Civil War. And it was a fiasco. About 3/4 of the colonists died or went back to the United States before a year had gone. Although Hawley himself stayed and made a community and founded the Protestant church in Haiti. I think it's very difficult to create out of scratch a community in a distant land.
Yes, no, there's many challenges, but again, I think as we're talking now, to at least give light to this type of topic, for what had happened and what is still ongoing probably, for this community, and to know that they came and they're existing in this part of the world.
I think that it's very important for us to know that Latin America is a land of immigration, and not just for Europeans in Argentina or Spanish but also for Chinese, like in Peru, Japanese, Filipinos, East Indians, particularly in places like Trinidad, that a lot of the culture of the Caribbean is based on Asian cultures and their mix with African cultures.
Yes, no, definitely, because there is a lot of movement, but we just don't know those stories or how they've come about. Because as you touched upon, in terms of, especially with the Chinese going to the Philippines and then coming into the Caribbean, that part of the narrative is just, again, not really told and not really discussed, and we only think of just one aspect, when there's more to the story and many layers. So thank you so much, Professor Robinson, for coming on to the podcast and being able to speak to this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.